A near universal experience for people is having a coworker that's just awful. It can be someone at your level who's an unbearable person to be around, constantly bitter about not getting a promotion no matter if they made motions towards getting one, do their job well, or even deserve it. Maybe they're a higher up, a manager that constantly demands too much of you and punishes you harshly when you can't meet their insane demands and standards. Alternatively, maybe you have a family member that you don't really get along with. They're annoying, bitter, and constantly judging you for faults perceived or otherwise, and give off an air of unbearable arrogance. Also, they beat their kids. Well, if you combine all these things, you get Perturabo. Primarch of the Iron Warriors, the more memorable of the two legions with iron in their name, and all-around bad person, bad leader, bad Primarch. When you get as many legions of Space Marines as we have, some of the Primarchs are going to be stinkers, and boy howdy is Perturabo a stinker. Not literally like Mortarion, but in terms of personality, I think I'd rather talk to a serial killer. Conrad Kurz may be awful, but he'd probably say something interesting in between carving off bits of my skin. And since I agreed to read Hammer of Olympia because I have trouble saying no to people, much like Perturabo, and boy that's not an insight check I want, here's a video on the man himself. Come with me as we go on both a journey through lore and a crash course of everything you shouldn't do to be a halfway functional human being. But before I begin, did you know that it's National Sleep Awareness Month? And what better way to mark the occasion than with Helix, the sponsor of this video? Did you know that 1 in 3 adults don't get the 7 to 9 hours of sleep like they're supposed to? Aside from obviously leaving you tired, this can hit you with anything from poor reaction times to heart problems to shooting your memory in the foot. And if you're using a mattress that isn't right for you, this can only be made worse. Old mattresses can be brutal on your back and be filled with things like dust mites after a long enough time. Getting a new one eventually can be just what you need. And luckily, Helix makes some damn fine mattresses. All you need to do to find which one is for you is take the Helix Sleep Quiz and it'll match you with their mattress suited to giving you the best night's rest possible. I've got a Helix Midnight Lux and that thing is wonderful. Every night it gives me the rest I need to actually function the following day, and it's so comfortable that I wish I was better at speaking so I could put into words just how comfy it is. And it ain't just me saying that either. 82% of participants in the Helix Wesper sleep study saw improved sleep. With a 120-day sleep trial and a lifetime warranty, there's no reason not to give it a shot. And to get yourself a fine Helix mattress, look no further. Use the link in the description and pinned comment to take advantage of Helix's March Madness sale for 20% off. That's the link in the description and pinned comment for 20% off your Helix order. You spend a third of your life asleep, so get yourself a fine Helix mattress to make sure you're resting your best. Now then, go gadget kill 1 in 10 of my children. Perturabo shares the same backstory as all his Primarch brothers do. The Emperor needed good generals for his armies when he would conquer the galaxy during the Great Crusade. In older lore, it was as simple as that. In newer lore, he had the added downside of having pissed off all his perpetual allies by being himself in a variety of no doubt creatively awful ways. So he made a bunch of demigod test tube babies with the intent of using them to lead his armies, because people who defend his parenting see no issue with the idea of having children's for the sole purpose of war. I'm gonna be this bitter and smug the entire video, fair warning, because what better attitude is there to go into a video about Perturabo? Anyways, their test tube mom Erda, or some Chaos Space Marines time traveling, or the Chaos Gods, or whatever retcon they're going with this time, catapulted all the Primarchs into the warp as wee little babies, sending them across the galaxy and ensuring the opening acts of the Great Crusade were goddamn fetch quests. A rough start to be sure, but thankfully for the setting existing, the Imperium, even without its chief future generals, was chugging along better than most were at the time, so the Emperor rode forth to look for him. Perturabo ended up on the planet of Olympia. Supposedly he had spent his first year or so on the planet wandering around, slaying monsters, and just being a wanderer. His very first memory was not of that, however. You ever see those jokes about suddenly gaining consciousness as a 3-year-old or whatever? Well, in Perturabo's case, this happened when he was in the middle of climbing a cliff face. But consciousness apparently struck Perturabo like a semi-truck, because he went from no memory prior to comprehensive knowledge of everything ever. While it obviously wasn't true omnipotence, there's a passage about him looking at a rock and thinking about all the geological processes that had resulted in that rock coming to form. Knowledge of rocks might not sound like the most impressive of things in Warhammer, but this is him as a kid, and it was just many of the things he suddenly knew. Anything he didn't know, such as star formation and whatnot, he had theories on that were ultimately correct. AKA, he knew, but wasn't able to go out and prove his theories yet. He knew blacksmithing for something more low-key, to knowledge of engineering and countless more things. This did, in many ways, make him feel robbed. As much as it would be nice to just know how to do anything perfectly, it robbed him of the joy of discovery discovery and learning. Indeed, he looked at a palace of what would become his foster father, and while he could appreciate it as a well-made piece of architecture, he instantly knew everything that had gone into it, which ruins the wonder a bit to be sure. The only two things he couldn't remember were what he was doing prior to climbing the cliff, which he learned about soon enough, and why the hell the Eye of Sauron was looking at him at all times. Turns out, Perturabo had the Eye of Terror itself staring at him for as long as he could remember. Not exactly a good sign, and one of the few things I'll give him credit for. I'd probably be a bit messed up too if I had hell itself staring at me since birth. It should be mentioned prior to his sudden brain unlock, he supposedly had to learn things normally, albeit Primarch speeds, but after that the knowledge of the universe was at his fingertips. Olympia would turn out to be the worst planet he could have landed on, and not because it was all things considered a terrible place to live. Much like Macleod, it was ancient Greece in space, but Perturabo's perception of things is immediately tainted by his strange knowledge of everything and his bitterness, which was apparently also an inbuilt personality trait. He was near immediately tested by what would become his adopted father, Damokos, known as the Tyrant of Lokos. He was to forge a sword, which he did perfectly, and from there Perturabo became the golden goose of Damokos, something used to achieve power beyond what he could ever have had before. That's not an untrue way of looking at things at all. Olympia was a place of constant politicking in games, both within a given city-state's court and in interactions with other polities. Perturabo was used to expand Damokos' reach and power, and due to his inbuilt knowledge, he succeeded at everything. He was a brilliant statesman, engineer, architect, combat, great at diplomacy. Anything that could build an empire, he could do. As much as he was good at warfare, however, he told his adopted father immediately after he forged his perfect sword that he would prefer to build temples and work with wonders. He resented being used in such a manner, wanting to make buildings and architectural masterpieces, but forced to build weapons. He was also surrounded by a very religious society, one worshipping the ancient Greek gods with the serial numbers filed off, but he despised it. He was a very rational man and found the idea of not being able to prove the gods existed proof they didn't, and that they were the enemies of reason. The enemy of reason thing is a bit much, but that viewpoint isn't inherently stupid, even as a religious person myself. But as written in the book, it's another moment the Horus Heresy would have benefited by consulting a theologian rather than a Reddit atheist. Turns out Perturabo is just like the Emperor when it comes to looking at a church and going, hee silly sky god isn't real, and thinking they've just reinvented millennia of religious debate with that comment. But as I said, he let his own viewpoints and initial judgments color his impressions when he really should have kept more of an open mind. Damokos was a tyrant, Perturabo wasn't wrong, but this is also in the original sense of the word, where it was rather more simply a ruler without the law to worry about. Originally, that word didn't necessarily have evil connotations, and indeed Damokos doesn't seem to have been particularly evil. He had the shepherds that reported Perturabo's location rewarded, and he wasn't inherently opposed to Perturabo doing wonderful architectural things. And as for using Perturabo for his own gains, he did, but this was in many ways just Olympian society. They were a fairly paranoid and opportunistic lot, but not in a full-on Starscream way. I won't say that a society where assassination was relatively common was a great one to grow up in, or would indeed anyone looking outside in feeling impressed. But he wasn't solely used for greed, nor was he always being used. Damokos did attempt to bring Perturabo into the fold in all ways, teach him values, bring him into his family. This was done opportunistically, but it wasn't always opportunistic. There were rewards, there was kinship, there was camaraderie to be found. The entire society of Olympia felt mercantile in some ways with what being used really meant. While I'm not saying it's good, it in some ways feel almost like a social obligation. We work together or are related in some way, so I'll use your talents to get ahead and you'll do the same with me. After that, everyone goes to hang out and chill and enjoy the fruits of their mutual scheming. But Perturabo was hung up on the first bit and refused to accept the other bits that weren't all about politics and the like. He saw himself as being used for no other purpose than war and gaining power, and so that's all he allowed himself to consider he was wanted there for. The only major exception to this was his sister Calliophene, and I'd wager that's in no small part because her efforts to understand him half involved treating him like the specialist boy in the world, which in itself would still sometimes piss off Perturabo when she took extra care to try and not annoy him. Any religious aspect of Perturabo's dislike for his home, however, I have little in the way of any kind of excuse for, mainly because, as I've said, the entire imperial truth aspects of the Horus Heresy feels like they're written by, shall we say, people I suspect have never put much thought into faith as a thing. Come a few years into Perturabo's life, however, and the day arrived for him as it did all his brothers, the arrival of the Emperor. It was fairly uneventful as far as Primarchs beating big egos. He submitted to the Emperor right away and even outed his adopted father from power. Damokos tried to regain power before and failed, but that did create some unrest that would cause issues later on. More on that to come. Perturabo briefly had some hopes that the Imperium was just what he always wanted. He would finally be allowed to build wondrous things across the galaxy and enlighten society that allowed his gifts to be nurtured, and in turn, he could gift the galaxy his knowledge. And then he found out that his dad was the Emperor and was just another conqueror, if one that was a fair bit shinier and more powerful than any other he had ever seen or heard of. To say his bitterness only grew was an understatement, and again in this instance I can't entirely blame him for it. The phrase "never meet your heroes" comes to mind, especially since Perturabo correctly assumed he hadn't simply been born, but made for things beyond the average person. He saw in the Imperium a chance to become what he was meant to be, and all he was able to do was be another general. After spending only roughly a year on Terra, coming to grips with all he needed to know, and notably striking up a bit of a friendship with Magnus the Red, he was granted control of the Iron Warriors and did what almost everyone aware of him knows about him doing. He perused through his son's records, saw that they weren't up to snuff with what he wanted, and had them draw straws. 9 out of 10 of them got the good straw. 1 out of 10 got the bad one, and so it was that the 9 beat the 1 to death. Decimation, in a less needlessly roundabout way of putting that, in the traditional sense of destroying 1 out of 10. Basically, everyone else at the time was highly critical of this, but Perturabo worded it as not a punishment, but a way to have his legion meet its full potential, and so the Emperor allowed it. Maybe Big E had a brief look in the mirror that should have been a lot longer, and figured that he had no right to judge someone else for murdering others and calling it a good thing in the end. From there, Perturabo proceeded to be simultaneously a brilliant commander and the worst commander ever. As someone raised great at siegecraft even before he was found by the Emperor, his specialty naturally ended up gravitating towards the most grueling and brutal war fronts there were. Not quite as literally poisonous as fields the Death Guard might be sent to, the Iron Warriors were in the worst traditional battlefields. If trench lines ran across the planet and going through them was the only option, you could find the Iron Warriors plying their trade and suffering massive casualties for it. He always achieved victory, and his enemies either brought into the fold of the Imperium or crushed outright, but it almost always came at an extreme cost. Over 50% of forces deployed being destroyed was no rarity, and against forces like the Hrud, thousands upon thousands of Marines were destroyed by them for basically no real gain. Orbital bombardment or other strategies oftentimes weren't considered, even if they really should have been, and the Iron Warriors would probably come to fondly remember the time he only had 1 in 10 of them killed as opposed to 1 in 2. It's legitimately to the point that you have to wonder if he wasn't doing this on purpose. He wasn't happy with the Imperium, or his father, or his standing with either, and is supposedly a genius of a Primarch to almost author favoritism levels on occasion. And yet he constantly suffered such catastrophic losses against opponents that had no right inflicting them if he played his cards well that at a certain point, self-sabotage becomes a real potential reason for his record. If not, then all supposed genius was overhyped to hell, and in either case, throwing away countless lives because you're too angry to raise a fuss over your position is monstrous. But he was also apparently good enough at logistics and setting up supply lines that at the end of the day, it didn't matter. The losses were promptly replaced, the war resumed, and his complaints both ever increasing and ever ignored, because he never voiced them. Bitterness and spite, as I'm sure you already knew, are the 2 words that best describe Perturabo even more so than genius might. The most constant interactions he had with his brothers and the Emperor were tainted by these traits, and it most certainly showed. Dorn is, of course, the most obvious one. Though mostly on Perturabo's end, there were, to put it lightly, some harsh feelings between the two, partially stemming from what could potentially be misunderstandings, and partially from Perturabo being a man-child and Rogel Dorn being as good as expressing himself as the brick wall he is. Close to the start of the heresy, I believe, in the timeline, Perturabo found himself a painting of a battle. The painting depicted an Imperial fist standing triumphantly while an Iron Warrior was face down in the dirt, and showed just which legion was better than the other. Now, in truth, it was just a fist's apothecary granting a quick death to a mortally wounded Marine with a banner in the background, but Perturabo was the kind of person who immediately formed the worst opinion possible, and that's it. He saw the fist triumphant, the Iron Warriors in the dirt, and got ass mad. He even bought the painting just so he could destroy it. Rogel Dorn saying that Perturabo would have no chance of cracking his own defenses was also a sore spot, though given Rogel Dorn's personality, there's equal odds he was being arrogant as he was taking pride in his work, which Perturabo misconstrued as an insult. Maybe he would have said the same thing about a fortress Perturabo built if the situation was reversed, but Perturabo takes anything but someone kneeling down and sucking him off as the highest form of criticism and slander. In truth, all of his brothers, even Horus, would dislike working with the guy, or at least make jokes at his expense. Magnus the Red, of all people, ironic given that Perturabo held mysticism and the like in contempt, was the best friend he had. I can see it a bit though. They're both dreamers, and Magnus is all about understanding the warp, which as insane as it and the concept of understanding it is, no doubt help the two get along. Being able to bring order and reason to the warp is the kind of goal Purdy would no doubt love to see accomplished, so maybe they came together over that and the shared arrogance they each held. He respected a few others to some extent too, at least enough to work alongside them on projects. He actually helped Gilliman in creating his Horus Heresy area armor, the Armor of Reason. Everyone who worked with him came away with nothing but good things to say about his capabilities too, because Perturabo was good at what he did. Problem was his personality, which boy howdy did that get under people's skin. He was also a firm believer in manning up, as it were, keeping all semblance of emotions under lock and key and attempting to present himself as a stone-cold man at all times. In some aspects, this is understandable. In wartime, you have to do what you're told since you're likely to get shot otherwise. Sometimes it's time to nut up and shut up. But this attitude extended towards even the most appalling of campaigns and actions he took, be it abandoning civilians because he couldn't immediately take care of all of them, or just throwing his men into a meat grinder. The idea of a soldier understanding they may very well die means a lot less when you're practically throwing their lives away. He saw his legion and other forces like we see soldiers in a game of Risk, not as living people, but as numbers to be used until the day is won. If people complained about this, he met them with judgment and punishment, and for that matter, he met them with that anyways, even if they just failed an impossible task. Such was the case with Barabbas D'Antioch, who was his favorite marine, more or less, until that business with the Hrud. D'Antioch made the mistake of not doing a Dark Souls hitless run on the Hrud, and also suggested that maybe headbutting their problems until either the problem or their skulls broke wasn't the best way of doing things. In response, Perturabo relegated him to garrison duty in the ass end of nowhere. Aside from this likely ensuring Barabbas never turned traitor, this also had the effect of letting Barabbas do exactly what Perturabo always wanted to do, having fun in the corner of the galaxy building shit. This is not to say Perturabo was completely emotionless or blind to the plight of those under him. In fact, it was just the opposite. Whenever someone spoke ill of the Iron Warriors or their tactics, he grew incredibly defensive of his legion, since they did the dirty work no one else was willing to do. Now, if you'll forgive me the negativity here, and it's my video, so you have no choice but to excuse it, because I'm going to continue on regardless, I don't think this was all him actually being upset about his sons being judged. I feel like if he was really upset at that, he would have done something about them constantly dying. Instead, I wager he saw criticism of his legion as criticism towards him, which to him is always unwarranted, and assigned the other person as an idiot, and so he'd get angry over it. Of course, in that situation, the only proper response is to defend his sons, and so he did. Here's the translation guide. If Perturabo says his sons are great for doing the thankless tasks no one else will, that means he's great for doing the thankless tasks no one else will. Legitimately, it's like goddamn Lord Farquaad from Shrek, only Perturabo was annoyed that throwing lives away didn't give him medals and instead got him criticized. And he was incredibly emotional. He got better at hiding it as he grew up, but on Olympia he would go from 0 to 100 in a moment at his adoptive father, screaming at almost random the moment Perturabo decided the conversation was annoying him. And to reiterate, once he made his assumptions, he wasn't changing them. He saw his father as only using them to build and lead weapons of war to glory. His father was doing that, but also constantly and genuinely trying to get closer to him. He felt like he was intruding whenever he entered Perturabo's room. He tried to make him comfortable and give him room. Perturabo actually had 2 adoptive brothers as well, but they weren't his sister, who bent over backwards to try and get to know the standoffish and insular person that he was. Perturabo wanted to make wonders, and that's noble. The idea of doing anything but what he wanted, however, drove him to rage. This would stick with him into the Horus Heresy, but it seems his upbringing combined with the Imperium not being all that different is what drove him to quell this anger in public. He didn't think raising a stink would get him any better life, so he never did. Instead, he would spend his free time moping and hoping someone would just come down and give him a better life, better jobs, and better war fronts. And it isn't just me saying that. This is noted by several of his own sons during one of those campaigns where they were getting fisted up to the stomach. Fair's fair, he was ordered to purge the Hrud from what he himself knew was a strategically useless area from the galaxy. He also didn't raise an objection, didn't switch tactics when headbutting the wall didn't work, didn't bother engaging himself unless I missed something in the book. He made no effort to change things, and when his legion got a reputation for always taking these jobs and completing them, he never said anything to the contrary, so why would anyone feel the need to change things? And it's not like his was the only legion that would do these grim tasks without complaint. To really piss off Perturabo, the Imperial Fists would no doubt happily do it, because they actually would do whatever duty was needed of them without complaint. fight. If the Emperor told them to die, they'd ask him how many needed to. Perturabo wanted glory and recognition, but refused to do anything to truly earn it. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and Perturabo went out of his way to not cause a fuss to his detriment. For some things he could do that aren't me casting judgment on the guy, he could flawlessly understand binary. It was one of his favorite party tricks, for lack of a better way to put it, to interject himself into a conversation the Mechanica members were having in binary. And it should be noted that the things he made that weren't directly related to warfare were genuinely great. Being generous, like I said, him throwing men's lives away was just because of him viewing soldiers as pieces in a game of Risk, like I said. He did the math, found out he would win, and anyone who died doing it was irrelevant. This mathematical approach to things was his entire worldview, essentially, and while that might sound boring, he was able to use this ability to create true wonders. Imagine if you could mathematically craft the perfect joke that would lead everyone around you in tears and with hurt smiles from how funny it was. That was what Perturabo could do, and I'm not making that example up. He used humor just like that in debates to make the other guy look stupid all the time on Olympia before he joined the Imperium, and by that same token, he could mathematically create a cathedral or some sort of thing with just the right angles and columns and what have you to inspire awe and all that visited it. You know the Council of Nicaea where Magnus was tried? Well, Perturabo built the place it was held in, and originally did it for the purpose of holding the Imperium's version of the Olympics. The guy had an eye for beauty and damn near everything if he was allowed to indulge in the field. And for the slightest bits of praise I can offer him, not all his campaigns were brutal and horrid. The Iron Warriors did look up to him in a lot of ways, from simply as their Primarch to a brilliant general and fighter to just being brilliant. On his homeworld of Olympia, there was oftentimes raids from a group known as the Black Judges, a human civilization that had archaeotech that was able to do things like prolong their lives indefinitely at the cost of draining others their lives. They essentially had turbo dreadnought suits of armor for themselves and entire armies of drones to do their warfare. Perturabo's first true act, beyond telling his legion to kill themselves, was dealing with the Black Judges, and he did so handily. When he's doing his best to win and not sabotaging his efforts in petty rebellion, or alternatively actually maximizing his gains and losses and not treating everything like a math equation, the dude does tight and efficient work. But then we have quotes like the one from Rogel Dorn, where to paraphrase things, if someone puts a wall in front of Perturabo, he's almost incapable of doing anything but trying to go through it. Going around the wall doesn't factor in. Or a battle where he was working alongside the Raven Guard and was incredibly judgmental of Corvus Corax for not wanting to use his legion of Spec Ops troops to bull rush the front gate like a World War I trench charge. Even if he truly is brilliant, it's in a cold and clinical way designed to get things over as quickly and thoroughly as possible as a military action. And it's not even in a the needs of the many kind of way, because it seems like he was just ending the battle as quickly as possible a lot of the time without consideration for the after effects of what that meant. The idea of leaving things somewhat intact for later use or saving lives in the long run never factored in, just how many people dying would get things over as quickly as possible. And he was, of course, a traitor Primarch, and as such, one day came the moment where he was done with the Imperium. In his case, the cause was this mounting bitterness of not being allowed to play in the sandbox of the galaxy and his creator being no better than his adoptive father. When Olympia rebelled because of the problems his adopted father caused on his way out of power, in addition to Perturabo squeezing it dry for new recruits, he went back to deal with it in the Iron Warriors way. Are you being problematic? You get killed with bricks. Thus were massive amounts of Olympia's people and all those precious fortifications Perturabo once built razed to the ground. His sister, Caliphany, tore into him over this, and outright called him a petulant child, hiding in the corner and waiting for someone to come and call him a good boy and getting angry when no one did. Perturabo responded by killing her and then having a mental breakdown. Bipolar disorder is one way to put it, being the ultimate man-baby is another, and the one I'd rather go with. Horus would then come along and do his sly little charisma thing by way of telling Perturabo that he would be different from the Emperor, and he would be appreciated, and that he was so in the right for burning down his homeworld and killing his sister. If he could just join him in this heresy thing, all would work out great. And with Perturabo having already gone off the deep end, he threw his lot in with the traitors, and it was on. As is fairly well known, Perturabo carried a good half of the siege of Terra on his shoulders, something even his haters such as myself can't really deny. That said, across the heresy, though he did good work, he did suffer no small amount of defeats in various issues, and not all of them were even from loyalists. One not quite defeat was the Battle of Fall, one of if not the largest naval engagements of the heresy. Thorn's Retribution fleet came to blows with Perturabo and his forces, and Perturabo was expecting the fleet to be led by Sigismund when it was really commanded by one Alexis Pollux. Having his tactics engineered for entirely the wrong person threw a wrench into his plans, and after the battle was over, Perturabo concluded that if the Imperial Fist hadn't withdrawn on orders from Terra, it was likely they would have won the engagement. Ultimately a victory for the Iron Warriors, but one that came about not through any actual efforts on their part, but by orders on higher up calling back his foes. Aside from the hurt ego this no doubt caused, he grew increasingly paranoid, building himself some robotic bodyguards since a group of Imperial fists made it close enough to make an attempt on his life during the battle. He also went on a wacky ride with Fulgrim. TLDR, Fulgrim showed up with a prophecy about a superweapon called the Angel Exterminatus, located on a former Eldar world, which would no doubt help this heresy thing along quite nicely. Paranoia aside, Perturabo is a 40k character, and much like 40k readers, is always interested in a nice superweapon, because those are just fun. Come on, who doesn't like a good superweapon? So he and Fulgrim, alongside their legions, go on this merry adventure to get jumped by armies of intangible Eldar ghosts and Super Wraith Guard, because much like Craftel Nyandon, the only Eldar GW respects are the dead ones. Fair is fair again. This entire event, aside from being what leads to Fulgrim's ascension to Demon Princehood, does give Perturabo a few nicer bits to take the edge off him. He notes how the Emperor's children, even prior to the Siege of Terra, had fallen far from the noble warriors they once were, and does seem to lament the fact. Even acknowledging they were once noble and honorable warriors does mean he truly did hold them in high regard to some extent. He's given an artifact by Fulgrim that turns out to have been draining his soul to help fuel Fulgrim's ascension, and though he does cave Fulgrim's chest in with his weapon, he notably feels a little upset at the loss of his brother into this abomination. And I do have to give him credit for what he did to Fulgrim earlier. Fulgrim, by this point, was either secretly possessed by a Keeper of Secrets, or maybe not. That plot point was a bit all over the place. Either way, he was off the rails. Things like battle plans and not attending drug-fueled murder orgies were just so boring, and he was being a bit of a shitter on a mission alongside Perturabo. So Perturabo invited him for a chat at his workshop and showed Fulgrim this wonderful clockwork Warhound Titan. He gave Fulgrim a real close look at the thing to really appreciate its beauty, and so Fulgrim could see that it wasn't working. And he ensured it wasn't working, by way of smashing Fulgrim's face into it and beating the shit out of him in front of his entourage. And I have to be honest here, writing about this, I'm coming around to Perturabo a little bit. That's the realest shit I've ever heard of. Anyone who's ever worked a customer service job knows the urge to do that is overwhelming sometimes, and he got to do it. For a lot of the heresy, he was once again doing background stuff, albeit in a rather less horrific manner than during the Great Crusade. He would set up actual functioning supply lines for the traders by conquering and occupying Imperial worlds and setting up Iron Warriors to govern them and draw what recruits and supplies could be gathered, ensuring Horus actually had proper logistics. This unfortunately meant his own legion was stretched a bit thin, to the point that the Iron Warriors were oftentimes counting how many bolter rounds they had left. Not a good place to be. Eventually, Horus would give him a phone call, both to inform him that it's about time for that big ol' Siege of Terra, and to politely ask him if he could go grab Angron while he was on the way. And also, Angron's now a Demon Prince, so there might be some problems wrangling him. Okay, have fun, bye. Once again getting the short end of the stick, this amounted to Perturabo briefly going to war with the World Eaters, and he did phenomenally, beating the snot out of the Legion and even engaging Angron himself long enough for his specialized bolter rounds he cooked up to do the trick and capture to be possible. If I remember correctly, he gave Angron such a beating both physically and verbally that Angron started to shrink, calling out the fact that Angron's strength was no longer his own and he was still just as much a slave as he always was to the Emperor and on Nuceria. But before the Siege of Terra began, there was one last shithole warfront for Perturabo to fight in. Talarn, home of course to the Talarn Desert Raiders. It wasn't always a miserable place to be. In fact, it was once quite a nice planet to live on, all things considered. Then Perturabo deployed a virus bomb to the world, and it very quickly became a not-so-nice place to be, as virus bombs are wont to do to a location. While this did cause Talarn to become the hellhole it is in modern 40k, it didn't kill all the people on the world, who proceeded to hop into tanks and fight back. Reinforcements poured in from both sides. The conditions on the planet meant that deploying infantry in any meaningful fashion was basically impossible. Not unless you wanted the firestorms and leftover virus bits to kill them. And on this day, Perturabo learned a very important lesson. A tank shell fired by a normal human is just as impactful as one fired by a space marine. And I'm so glad he was given the chance to appreciate this, as millions of tanks on both sides went to war and Perturabo was once again denied a victory. His forces were there because they were searching for a fancy artifact for demonic power and whatnot, so on top of not getting it, he was kicked in the balls once more over what was aside from that a world with little value. It took Horus telling him to piss off from the planet for it to finally get through his head that he had better things to do. But the Siege of Terra came, and Perturabo's shining chance to kick Doran in the teeth was here. Unfortunately, as Horus too lamented, the traitor forces for the most part consisted of idiots and madmen. Perturabo was put in charge of devising battle plans and whatnot to break the invincible fortress of the Imperial Palace, on account of everyone else being at least least moderately insane, including Horus himself. His plans were efficient, well-made, and would likely have ensured a costly but inevitable victory if followed to the letter. And then the World Eaters and Emperor's children went off the rails, with the World Eaters wandering around slaughtering whoever they found instead of following objectives, and the Emperor's children doing largely the same thing, only those they found no doubt only wish they were killed instead. Additionally, no small amount of traitor forces other than the Iron Warriors were deployed via warp sorcery nonsense, meaning Perturabo once again taking the grueling job of pushing through defenses in a mundane way was largely meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Oh, and it went on as Perturabo watched the situation unfold, only growing worse. This had went from the climactic final battle to prove he was superior to Dorn and to unmake the Emperor's domain that was no better than that of Olympia, to him watching his brothers be proven to dislike him as much as he thought, while Horus was no better than his father. No one was listening to his plans in spite of him being made the acting commander of the invasion. His soldiers were the only ones not marching alongside demons or corrupted by chaotic energies to some degree. This was not a test to prove which brother was superior and to bring down the Emperor, yet another tyrant to overthrow. This was all too much, and after Horus gave him one more order he thought was bullshit, he had enough. He commanded all his Iron Warriors to leave Terra, and leave they did. He still presumed Horus would win and began making plans to kill him, all the while his emotions raged and he threw a temper tantrum like Kylo Ren over the entire affair. The heresy ended for Perturabo here, not with a bang, nor a whimper, but a defiant middle finger coming from a man who'd spent centuries digging himself into a hole and was only just beginning to realize how deep he had gotten himself. Of course, that's not where his story ends. Peter Turbo, in his immense spite, decided that if he couldn't break through to Dorn, he'd make Dorn break through to him, and thus do we come to the Iron Cage. On Dorn's end, this was both trying to capture Perturabo, but more importantly, allowing his legion to atone for the perceived failure at the Siege of Terra, as well as letting them go out before they split into chapters one more time as a proper legion. For Perturabo, spite match baby! The battle in space kept the Fist from performing any kind of orbital maneuver, and so the grueling ground war began. Inch by inch, the Imperial Fist crawled through with Dorn at their head, suffering constant losses until they got to the keep at the center to drag Perturabo out. The keep was, of course, empty, because Perturabo was trying to make Rogel Dorn out to be a failure who threw his men's lives away in a pointless assault. Apparently, irony is one field Perturabo was never granted inherent knowledge of. And unfortunately for him, even after the keep was revealed to be a trap with nothing but the guns pointed inward in it, the Imperial Fist and Dorn still didn't break. They couldn't, because they already had at Terra, and the cage was to reforge them, and Perturabo's plan to make Dorn out to be a fool backfired into Dorn being revered as someone who continued to drive off traitors to the very end. Also, the Ultramarines came to save the remaining Fists, so even after Perturabo basically nuked the whole planet, he didn't even get the satisfaction of seeing Dorn atomized. It wasn't a complete wash, although in many ways the gains from the Iron Cage were ones Perturabo would wish he never got. Aside from a lot of dead Fists, always a pleasure for him, the Imperial Fist gene seed captured here that wasn't used to make funky Iron Warrior and Fist hybrids was sacrificed to the Dark Gods and allowed Perturabo to ascend to Demon Princehood. This would rather go against his modern lore as someone so inherently against warp stuff that the usage of it was in part why he dipped out of the Siege of Terra. But there are at least two possible reasons it happened, neither of which are mutually exclusive. Perturabo at one point spoke with the demon Sara'am, a demon born from the first time a mortal made a weapon with the express purpose of killing another person. He promised Perturabo weapons for the coming conflicts ahead. Knowing demons, and really the idea of making pacts with demons in general, it's entirely possible Perturabo got his weapons in the form of demonic ascension, whether or not he wanted it. Pacts with the devil, after all, rarely go well for anyone but the devil. Well, the devil and Johnny, but Perturabo doesn't strike me as much of a fiddle player, and I don't think Olympia was located near the state of Georgia at any rate. Plus, consider that Perturabo had by this point had his dreams of being allowed to use his talents of a better world dashed by both the Emperor and Horus, as well as the fact that Fulgrim caused some of his soul to drain out. Desperation makes a man do crazy things, and it's possible that Perturabo didn't have much of a choice if he wanted to continue living. Hell, could be both. Maybe he thought he could fix his soul while somehow not falling to chaos in spite of a potential pact, and it bit him in the ass. Plus, he is a Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided. This is about as close to being unchained by anyone as you can get, since there's no one god that has his soul on a leash. Just chaos as a whole, though undivided princes aren't really a thing anymore, so how independent he is debatable. He would go on to do a few things of note in between the end of the heresy and modern 40k. He once annihilated a Forge world in just 8 days by way of unleashing a virus that caused the entire thing to become alive and malicious. He helped Abaddon beat up the Iron Hands once, though not directly. And during a massive Iron Warriors civil war in M34, he was fairly passive, but there's evidence to suggest that the entire thing was orchestrated by him to weed out the weak amongst his legion. Never really got over doing that bit, though now Decimation has been upgraded to lighting a fuse and saying good luck to whoever's in the room. He also got in a fight with Mortarion that he lost, but he left after detonating a bunch of bombs just to get the last word in. And since GW has been bringing Primarchs back, I'm sure he's not far behind. As of writing this, the Iron Warriors have had some new stuff come out for him, a new Warsmith most prominently, and some shoulder pads specifically for Iron Warriors also coming out. No doubt the Iron Warriors will be their own army again soon, since 40k is rapidly turning into the Horus Heresy sans Horus, so when that happens, I'm sure Mr. Perturbed himself will be revealed. Fair warning though, for those of you who want something real creative, his Demon Primarch form is supposedly just him, only a lot bigger with more cables. He's even wearing the same armor. Now, Perturabo, again, as of time of writing, isn't out yet, though I'd bet damn good money he will be within a year of me writing this very sentence. But for fun, I figure I can maybe theory-craft him a bit, and the lore aspects of a do-or-don't form will likely be the same either way unless he's suddenly a completely new character upon release. For lore positives of Peter Turbo, you get to feel the Primarch of the Traitors that isn't a complete moron. Every other Primarch's approach to handling warfare is to essentially go, nah, I'd win, and by virtue of being Primarchs and therefore GW's golden boys, this works out until another Primarch shows up to beat him up. On the traitor side at least, Perturabo is the only guy who actually knows warfare is warfare. He can do some crazy magical stuff, see him turning a whole Forge World alive, but he's also the guy to actually plan a campaign and wage warfare properly. So if you want chaos, but chaos that isn't soaked in magical nonsense completely through, he ain't a bad choice. He's also a solid pick if you want someone independent. Chaos Undivided, as I said earlier, is a bit of an underutilized thing nowadays, but assuming GW doesn't ruin it and make this bit completely incorrect, he's about the most independent you can get as a Chaos Primarch. I've no doubt he won't be happy with where he's at in life, but I also assume that as Chaos Undivided, he'll largely be free to do what he wants. Sort of like a mini Ever-Chosen or War Master, Chaos Undivided sorts are largely free to do their own thing as long as it's still chaotic. He's still gonna be evil and need some warp stuff to function, but there's no single deity he has to bend the knee to, so it's likely that he'll be the best Primarch if you want chaos but don't want to have to follow an agenda for your army. Hell, flavor Perturabo to be the new Malal, and no, I don't mean malice, fuck off. Raging against anyone who comes near him, chaotic or not, Perturabo brings ruin to all who oppose him and the Iron Warriors alike. As for tabletop positives, he's no doubt going to be tough as hell with a good amount of wounds. All Primarchs are, but I wouldn't be surprised if they double down on it for him. Could be something like having damage, or it could be as simple as him having higher toughness than most others. I would also imagine that he'll provide buffs to either shooter units, vehicles, or obliterators. All of those seemed like the kind of thing he'd be interested in, especially vehicles given his history as a siege warfare expert. Maybe expect something along the lines of rerolls to hit and wound rolls to vehicles if Perturabo's in your army. Alternatively, maybe he'll debuff enemy vehicles, since the Lord of Iron is clearly proficient in tech and he's no doubt just as capable of ruining things as he is at improving them. I can also imagine him being a particularly shooty Primarch at that, since part of siege warfare does involve shooting people, if you'll excuse the intense analysis there. I bet there'll be some big gun attached to his arm that can blow anyone he looks at away. And I'm sure his model is going to be gorgeous. I know there have been some complaints, but honestly, I like all the Demon Primarch models, even Fulgrim and his Coke face. I'm sure Perturabo will be given something equally fitting, and even if it isn't quite to your liking, it'll be the highlight of any army he's in easily. As for lore downsides, he is Perturabo. He's an unpleasant, paranoid, arrogant piece of shit whose entire history is being a stubborn man-child and refusing to acknowledge that his method of hoping someone else just walks up and praises him was never going to work. There's quietly doing your tasks and accepting things, there's wanting better things and striving for them, and then there's the awful middle ground of being a bitter asshole and doing nothing but stewing in it. For all his legitimate grievances, and they do exist, such as how he was forced to once again be a weapon for a father that this time actually didn't care for him, he did nothing to help himself. Nothing but throw his sons into meat grinder after meat grinder, wonder why his life sucked. Maybe he kept his emotions in check because he was afraid of being seen as weak, or used further, or some other reason. But he never addressed them in any way, and they ate him and countless others alive for it. He was an asshole to even people like Magnus. One time Magnus asked him to build a psychic device. He did, then crushed it in front of him to try and illustrate that warp stuff should never be delved into. Methinks a simple no would have sufficed, dickhead. I can respect wanting to play an evil character. I love Nagash and the Skaven, but Perturabo is not fun evil. Perturabo is a jealous, spiteful prick who's upset that everyone else that actually does things worth rewarding, and more importantly, don't get their entire army obliterated in the process, is rewarded. He's a pathetic person. He's worthy of nothing but pity at most and outright contempt at worst. All of the Primarchs being far more human than most of them would like to admit is something that runs in common between them. In Perturabo's case, he has the mindset of the most sad person you've ever met, amplified by 1,000. He's also still ultimately a slave to chaos, even if it's general chaos. Pro tip, if you require human sacrifices and warp rifts to properly materialize in anywhere but hell, you aren't truly a free man. He'd likely deny it, and he did deny Nurgle himself and refused to become a demon prince under his thrall, but at the end of the day, he's a demon and so inherently is stuck with certain circumstances. Sucks to suck, bozo. For tabletop downsides, I imagine that for his point cost, he's not going to be the best in a close-up fight. Relatively, of course, a Primarch is always going to smash things near them, and he's no slouch in melee, but I assume he's going to be at his best at a moderate distance from the melee. Overwatch and the shooting phase are his to win, but if someone like Angron or Kayn gets close, he might be in trouble. I can also imagine that he might be one of the more specialized Primarchs in terms of list building if his rules play out how I think they will. He'll no doubt be able to kick ass in any situation, but compare him to Angron. There are very few times Angron won't be able to comfortably fit in with a list theme, because a list where the World Leaders aren't trying to rush in to beat everyone to pace is a bad World Leaders list. Whatever your army comp with them is, Angron works. But Peter and his turbo boost might need certain units in the list to be most effective. This is again assuming he does buff specific things like I think he might, and I could be wrong, but I'm happy to potentially look stupid and be wrong here, because if I'm right, then my internet bragging rights cock will be the biggest in all the land. As for his points, he's no doubt going to be expensive. Primarchs tend to, much like the narrative, force the army to at least in part be built around them unless you're playing something like Apocalypse, in which case they're a drop in your mortgage payment-sized bucket. So even if everything else I predict is totally wrong, you can be sure of the fact that he'll be expensive, big, and if you lose him early on or don't use him well, he's going to be a waste of points. For that matter, I'm sure his real-life price tag is going to be substantial too, because affordability is for the peasants, you see. And that was Perturabo. Every time I read something about him, or write something about him, or think about him lately, my opinion kinda wavers back and forth. Still gonna stick to saying I hate him though, the man really is awful. Anyone else with his capabilities would be great, but unfortunately for Warhammer and us the audience, we have to deal with this asshole. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Iron Warriors to my Perturabo, being used and abused while I cry that things aren't fair even though I could probably be making things a lot easier on myself. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Alright, so on a near completely unrelated note that'll be slightly censored because I've already used my one F-bomb per video, smash, marry, kill Perturabo, Astolfo from Fate, and the Hunter Worms from Halo. I'd kill Perturabo immediately, marry Astolfo because I'd get a free supply of monster energy for the rest of my life, and I'd smash the Hunter Worms. If that last bit sounds strange to you, consider I want to see what happens if I let one crawl up my butthole and do wacky things to my prostate.